Okay, everyone, good afternoon, or good morning, or evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this first ever session of our new series, Aleksanteri Alumni Talks, where we'll hear insights on the current research by alumni of our Visiting Fellows program. And we are proud to have had such a great group of scholars coming to work with us through this program. And now it's our pleasure to get to know more on their recent work and what they are doing after their visit in Helsinki. My name is Anna Korhonen. I'm head of international affairs here at the Aleksanteri Institute at the University of Helsinki. And it's my pleasure to chair this session. And today we have the privilege of having Luca Anceschi from the University of Glasgow to walk us through his analysis based on several years of work on and in Kazakhstan on its politics, identity, and foreign policy. And Luca's talk is titled Neo-Eurasianism Kazakhstani-style foreign policy, power and identity in the Nazarbayev era. And Luca, as I'm sure many of you know, is a foremost Central Asia analyst. So this is a wonderful opportunity for all of us to learn and to update our understanding on the region and Kazakhstan in particular, of course. And Luca has just recently published a book on this topic, on the topic of his talk, and I'll put the name of the book in the chat so you can take questions. Okay, thanks so much for everyone. And Luca, now please, the screen is yours.
Much, Anna. It's always a great pleasure to, not to be at the Aleksanteri. I'm not there, but it's like I'm there. So, it's a privilege for me to actually present the result of this research to such an expert audience. So, as Anna was saying, the book from which today's lecture really arises has been the product of 7 years of research, 4 research trips to Kazakhstan, and the systematic engagement with a lot of official sources and official documents on Kazakhstani foreign policy. I'm going to, it's obviously very difficult to condensate so much research, so many words into 20 minutes, but I'll try to give you an overview of the findings that the book does, so that if there are things on which you're interested, you can then either get the book if you had the chance, or you can keep emailing me and I'm sure I can answer that. And I was always very curious before starting this project about what does it mean to be an Eurasian state in policy terms. You hear a lot in Central Asia especially, and Kazakhstan even more so. We are a Eurasian state, we are located at the heart of Eurasia, our identity is Eurasianist, but I could never really understand what the belonging to such a complex identity source, Eurasia, actually implements in policy terms. And it is very much similar to what you see in the literature on European state, like a place like Italy will discuss how do we behave as an European state. I just translate this kind of puzzle into the post-Soviet landscape to try to work out what are the policy implications of the Eurasian identity that Nursultan Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan first president, actually brought to the fore almost systematically for the 30 years in which he was on power. So the idea was try to engage with the Kazakhstani official thoughts on Eurasianism, try to describe what the Kazakhstani version of Eurasianism really was, as opposed to those developed in Russia, either in contemporary Russia or in prior historical eras by Russian thinkers or by Russia-based scholars, and try to work out what is the contribution of the Kazakhstani version to this idea of Eurasianism widely intended. And, I think that it is extremely interesting to see this idea of Eurasia, Eurasianism, not from the center, that is Russia, but from the periphery, that's Kazakhstan. So in that sense, I got to query a lot of general assumptions on what modern version of authoritarian of Eurasianism really is. And the main conclusion which I've drawn is that the form of Eurasianism which we did see in the Kazakhstani context, and I did detect while writing this book, is a very official form, is perhaps the only case in the well, in the modern world in which we have seen the rise and the crystallization of an almost official doctrine of Eurasianism. Because Kazakhstani Eurasianism was born, was consolidated and developed within the authoritarian context in which the Kazakhstani government operates. And it is precisely for this reason that I called Kazakhstani Eurasianism regime Neo-Eurasianism, because in that sense, I characterize the political settings in which this idea developed, regimes or authoritarian, the more recent version, so the Neo qualifier, and then its relation to the Eurasianism tradition and the Eurasian, well, if you want, philosophy or worldviews. And so this is the wider context in which I did immerse my research. And when it comes to describing the finding, I always make the distinction between a number of findings which were quite, which I could see why research, so they were kind of, I could anticipate their relevance vis-a-vis the overall argument, but also one which is extremely surprising when it comes to its ultimate impact on how we understand this policy system based on Eurasianism. And also what I do in the book, I try to challenge a couple of myths that surround the normal interpretation of Kazakhstani foreign policy. I wanted the time to go into both myths, but I just want to make one general observation about one of the two challenges which I brought forward to the mainstream characterization of Kazakhstan foreign policy. A lot of people say, and the government says as well, that Kazakhstani foreign policy is based on a multivectoral approach. Multivectorism is what they do, multivectorism is what they pursue, and they show the example of Kazakhstan being equidistant between different powers, Russia and China, but also between different kind of environment, geopolitical environment like Europe and Asia, and so on. Well, the book challenges this characterization, and it almost calls for the death of Kazakhstani multivectorism, which is an idea that is obviously not to be found in the official rhetoric, is not to be found in the way in which Kazakhstani scholars relate to the foreign policy, and it's also kind of not to be found in how Western observers relate to that. And my point, very briefly, if you want, we can go into this in the Q&A, is that if you talk about significant substantive policy directions, so areas in which you are truly integrating and you are truly pursuing an actual integration, an actual policy, rather than just rhetorical emphasis, well, there is no such thing in multivectorism, because in the last 30 years, Kazakhstani Eurasianism mostly developed in the post-Soviet environment through organizations that were either led or that included in their membership the Russian Federation. So the bilateralization of Kazakhstani foreign policy, keeping Russia at the center of this system, is actually one of the indicators that I do use when I query this idea that Kazakhstan is multivectoral. And it is something which I also be discussing with, not with the Kazakhstani foreign policy makers, but with the Uzbek foreign policy makers, for instance. And their idea is that Kazakhstani multivectorism is an example to follow, whereas the book really shows that there is not much beyond the superficial rhetoric to that. Let me just now introduce the two main findings which I want to bring to your attention today. And the first finding, the one which I thought is perhaps the least surprising, but nonetheless as a very important one, is that Kazakhstani Eurasianism is a personalist foreign policy. So it's a foreign policy in which the role of the former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, both as a policy creator, if you want, as the Kazakhstani intellectual responsible for the formulation of Kazakhstani Eurasianism, but also as a policy operator, because he is the politician who came up with a series of different initiatives to operationalize this idea of Kazakhstan being essential, a Eurasian and a Eurasianist country. So in that sense, we've seen Nazarbayev emerging as the unchallenged leader when it comes to foreign policy, making Kazakhstan in a move that, of course, is very similar to the Central Asian norm, in which you see that the foreign policy is done by personal contact between the president, but also in a deliberate propaganda strategy in which we see the president as being glorified for the policy that he formulated, regardless of the effect of the policy itself. And what's important about this, my analysis of the role that the president had in the formulation of Kazakhstani Eurasianism, is that it is particularly clear to me that the propaganda wants us to believe that this is a solo effort, that it was Nazarbayev policy drive that led to the success, they call it, of Kazakhstani Eurasianism. And and there is a lot of authorship, a lot of literature which Nazarbayev has been claiming to write, but obviously a man can't do everything by himself in this context. So we know that most of them would be ghostwritten, but I also identified a few people, and they were mostly other politicians, or like Mansurov or Isingarin, and think tankers like Bulat Sultanov, who actually did emerge as supportive writers in Kazakhstani Eurasianist literature. What's important, though, that unlike Russia, the Kazakhstani production of Eurasianist themes in either newspapers or in books, it's very much limited to this idea of Kazakhstan foreign policy as an Eurasian byproduct. So it shapes as very much as a non-intellectual endeavor. That's Eurasianism in that sense. So Kazakhstani Eurasianism is very different from the one that we've seen developed in Russia because of this ultimately non-essential, non-intellectual, component. And what is also important about that it becomes an instrument of authoritarian consolidation, because the placement of the president at the very center of Eurasia and also of the Eurasianism, that's very important, is actually a construct that reinforces the power dimension of Kazakhstani foreign policy. And that's why there is the power word in the title of today's lecture. Well, I think that now, if I have a couple more minutes, Anna, I think that I want to spend the last bit of this intervention talking about what is, to me, is the most important finding of the book, and one which I didn't really see coming, because, as I said before, my intention was to try to find out what does it mean to be an Eurasian state in policy terms. And once I acknowledge, which I did in the book, the flexibility of Kazakhstani foreign policy, the very flexible interpretation that the government has made of this idea of being an Eurasian state, a Eurasianist state, I worked out that there is no real intention the Kazakhstani government, Kazakhstani policymakers, and here I must be specific with the fact that the government had decided not to talk with me when it came to the interviews. I spoke informally with diplomats, and I spoke with former diplomats, but there wasn't much reception for that in the official world of diplomats for Kazakhstan. So that when it comes to defining Eurasia, when it comes to setting the geopolitical or geoeconomic or even the geographic boundaries of this entity in which Kazakhstan is supposed to operate as a truly Eurasian, a truly Eurasianist state. And I use this term interchangeably because the Russian expression doesn't differentiate between the two, as you know. So when it comes to determine what Eurasia is, they never tell us. There is not a single unequivocal statement, foreign policy statement, official declaration, treaty, or even just a foreign policy strategy produced at any stage by the government in Almaty first and Astana later that clearly identifies Eurasia at this particular area. So Eurasia becomes an unclear, oblique, if you want, a very opaque geopolitical entity. And while I studied the use that the Kazakhstani government has made of this context, what it seemed to be that Eurasia then becomes an exercise in geopolitical dissimulation. And I'm going to explain this, which is the last point I'm going to make today. Well, it is clear that if we look at the way in which Kazakhstan associates with other states in the context of the Eurasian strategy, they call it, we have, in the 1990s, the focus was very much on trying to remedy the dissolution of the USSR by coming up with a different association form. And that's the idea for the first Eurasian Union, the one in 94, the Moscow speech, which obviously collapsed straight away because Yeltsin wasn't interested, Karimov wasn't interested. So, but see, the target was a very post-Soviet understanding of what Eurasia is. Then in the 2000s, when Kazakhstan was trying to associate with Western forms of multilateralism, either through the European Union or to the OSCE, which then was successful in the end, we see that the government starts to talk about Eurasia as this undefined, very large landmass between Lisbon and Vladivostok. So you enlarge here the perception of Eurasia. But then when this idea starts to be associated with the respects of norms, which are an essential component of what Kazakhstan promised the OSCE to do, well, then as soon as the chairmanship ended in 2010, this idea of Eurasia disappears. And then throughout the return of Putin to the Kremlin and the very last long goodbye that Nazarbayev had in the last 10 years prior to finally leaving in 2019, we've seen the attention being rebuilt onto a very narrow, a core group of essentially post-Soviet states, Belarus, Russia, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, which are the membership of the Eurasian Economic Union, which we see at play now. And what's important about this is that while the idea of Eurasianism was always focusing on this changing understanding of Eurasia, the Kazakhstani government, in this exercise of geopolitical dissimulation, kept mentioning Eurasia as another option for integration. So they were working in the CIS, and they would say, yes, but we have Eurasian integration. They were working with the Evrazes, the Eurasian community, economic community, and they said, yes, but yet we have Eurasia. And now, even when they have the Eurasian Union with Russia and Belarus, the 2014-2015 one, we hear them saying, well, we need to do the integratie, and having the Eurasian Union integrated with the One Belt, One Road eventually. So, because that's what we are a Eurasian entity, and we need to think about what are Eurasia. So you see what I'm trying to say here is that Eurasia, if you listen and if you read Kazakhstani official propaganda, it becomes a mythical place, a place where you are offered better trading conditions. There is intrinsically more safety and security for you as a state, and a place where your sovereignty is more respected than it is in the organization where you currently are. So it became a place for rhetorical dislocation, a place where you ideally place yourself as a very successful state. But in ultimate terms, Eurasia becomes an almost empty construct, a construct which is not filled by geopolitical, geoeconomic, or whatever geo want to put there, context you have, but it's only dependent on the perception that the Kazakhstani regime makes of it. And obviously you can't do this because it really becomes a rhetorical problem to analyze this issue in policy terms. And my answer to that was that it was perhaps inevitable. It was perhaps inevitable because this was a foreign policy which was designed to serve a series of authoritarian, objectives, in which, of course, the preservation of the president at the center of the domestic discourse on foreign policy, but also at the center of a series of internationally based integration discourses, be they located in the former Soviet area or in the wider Eurasian space, that counted as well. Because this is a regime that, unlike Turkmenistan, for instance, is extremely conscious of its own image. So I think that my time has ended, and I thank you for your attention, and now I'm waiting for your questions from analysts and comments. Thank you.